management. We have Mr. Charles. First of all, Charles, thank you very much for spending your time giving us this great presentation, sharing with us this information. Charles is basically head of EHS team and directed as Antithesis in the Middle East. He has approximately 17 years of experience in the asbestos. And I request everyone to please mute your mic if you can ask the communication coordinator. Let's enjoy this great and this great meeting. Charles, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Syed. Let me just start sharing my screen. Can everybody see that? Syed, if you can give me a wave, let me know. Is my screen sharing? Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. As Syed mentioned there, my name is Charlie Faulkner. I'm the head of EHS for Antithesis Consulting in the Middle East. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about asbestos management. So the purpose of my presentation tonight is to raise the awareness of the asbestos risk here in the Middle East. During my presentation, I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that not only can asbestos be found in buildings both old and new, but it very well could be in the buildings that you work in, you live in, or visit on a daily basis. Now, in terms of my presentation content tonight, I'm going to start off by giving you an introduction to asbestos. So a bit of asbestos awareness to begin with. We're going to look at the background, history, and usage of this particular material, both on a global scale and a local scale. I'll talk you through the health effects associated with asbestos exposure and exposure to this deadly material. And then I'm going to talk to you about asbestos materials specifically in the Middle East. So what I'd like to do is show you some graphics, some images and photos taken from my 12 or so years experience in the Middle East, working on different asbestos related projects. Second part of the presentation, we're going to look at the legislation. So how do we actually control the risk from asbestos? Third and final section, this is a best practice approach to asbestos management. So what can we do by using international best practice and guidelines in order to manage the risk from asbestos? Now, there will be time for a questions and answers session at the end of today's session. So if you do have any questions or any queries, please write them down and please put them in the comments, and I'll do my very best to answer those questions or queries at the end of today's presentation. The presentation itself is about 30 minutes. And then there will be the Q&A session at the end. Okay, so without further ado, an introduction to asbestos. So asbestos is the term used to describe a group of fibrous minerals. These minerals are found in the ground. They're then commercially mined and refined in order to produce different types of asbestos-containing materials. The main properties of asbestos: they're very resistant to heat, chemically resistant, and they've got very good acoustic attenuation properties. So for these kind of reasons, the places that you're going to find asbestos in the building, anywhere where you need any fireproofing and heat resistant materials, anywhere where you need any chemically resistant materials, such as gaskets, and anywhere where you need any acoustic attenuation, so a loud area next to a quiet area. Typically used in construction materials, the most common ones are insulations and laggings, ceiling tiles, partition walls and fire breaks, and cementitious materials, gaskets, and vinyl floor tiles. Now, I mentioned there a moment ago, there's about 10 main asbestos-containing materials. But the fact of the matter is, it's been known to have been used in something like 3,200 products worldwide. It's a very, very cheap and very versatile building material. It can be mixed with pretty much any substrate to form an asbestos-containing material. So I mentioned a moment ago that asbestos is a mineral that comes out of the ground. This is a photo of the world's biggest asbestos mine. This is the Asbestos mine, as you can probably guess, in Russia. So the mineral is taken out of the ground, then taken to factories, and then turned into different types of building products known as asbestos-containing materials. On the left-hand side, you can see what the raw mineral looks like when it actually comes out of the ground. Interestingly, for our members here in the UAE, that photo and that sample was taken from a project in Fujairah. So there is naturally occurring asbestos that can be found in the Northern Emirates, Fujairah, and the neighboring country of Oman. There are three main types of asbestos. They are known as blue, brown, and white. Their technical names are chrysallite, amosite, and chrysotile. Now, when I say blue, brown, or white, I'm not talking about the color of the asbestos-containing material. It's actually the fiber type. So if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the raw mineral, and there's the blue, brown, and white asbestos. Now, blue is the most dangerous or the most carcinogenic, then brown, then white. But one thing to mention is that even though white is less toxic than the other two, all forms of asbestos are classed as a group 1 or grade 1 carcinogen. That is, their exposure to these asbestos minerals, regardless of whether it's blue, white, or brown, it is known to cause cancer in humans. And that is a direct quote from the World Health Organization. Health effects associated with asbestos exposure. If you breathe in the very, very small particles of asbestos dust, they can lodge themselves deep down in your lungs and cause what are known as asbestos-related diseases. The three most common asbestos-related diseases, these are asbestosis, mesothelioma, and asbestos-related lung cancer. Now, asbestosis is typically associated with only very high levels of asbestos exposure. So people working in the mines, people working in the factories, insulators, laggers, people that are involved in asbestos removal. However, mesothelioma and lung cancer can cause or can be caused by even small amounts of asbestos exposure. So there is no known safe level of asbestos. Much like smoking, it affects different people differently. In terms of the effects of these diseases, so they are almost always fatal. If you're diagnosed with an asbestos-related disease, you typically have less than 2 years to live. There's no known cure. Within that 2 years, these diseases are extremely debilitating. So your quality of life is reduced to almost next to nothing, and your condition worsens pretty much until the day that you die. It's pretty depressing stuff. A couple of additional factors to mention. So there is what's known as a latency period when it comes to asbestos. If you or I were breathing in asbestos fiber today, it could take 10, 20, or even 30 years before you would feel the effects of that asbestos exposure. These diseases take a very long time to manifest themselves. The other thing to mention is there is a multiplying effect with smoking. So if you smoke and you're exposed to asbestos, there's something like 100 times more possibility that you will develop an asbestos-related disease. So if nothing else, another good reason to stop smoking. Okay, quite graphic image on the screen there. So these are two different lungs taken from autopsies, so from two dead bodies. On the left-hand side, you can see a healthy lung. And on the right-hand side, you can see a lung affected by an asbestos-related disease, mesothelioma. So you can see the big sections of black, you can see the big sections where the tissue is missing. These are extremely destructive diseases. Mesothelioma, for example, you've typically got less than 6 months to live if you're diagnosed with mesothelioma. So the cancers will spread through the lung tissue and then onto the secondary organs, basically causing death and the expiration of the person diagnosed with these diseases. Statistics-wise, So the World Health Organization estimates that 107,000 people die every single year as a result of asbestos exposure. Now, the people that are dying today are obviously people that were exposed legacy, so 10, 20, 30 years ago. In the UK, the statistic is more like 5,000 people per annum. In the States, a bit more, 39,000 people every single year. And closer to home, in the UAE, unfortunately, the figures are unknown. Now, I don't believe for a second that this is because people are not being exposed to asbestos. From what I've seen over the past 12 years, I can guarantee that people are being exposed to asbestos, but there's a couple of factors that need to be taken into account. Number one, the medical data and records regarding asbestos deaths are simply not available. Number two, the people that are most likely to be exposed to asbestos fibre in the UAE are going to be migrant workers and expat workers. So if they're exposed today to asbestos fibre during demolition or refurbishment, it could take 10, 20, or even 30 years before they show symptoms of those diseases. In 10, 20, or 30 years, they're most likely to be back in their home countries and showing up as a statistic back there rather than here in the UAE. Final statistic for you, 10 million deaths worldwide have been attributed to asbestos exposure. No other hazard in the workplace has killed more people than asbestos. So if it's such a dangerous material, it begs the question, why is it still being used? So asbestos has only been banned in about 60 countries around the world. So all of the countries represented in green have now banned the use of asbestos. So North America, Europe, Australasia, but 60 countries, considering there's maybe 198 countries total, means that 2/3 of the world's countries are still using this deadly material. It's typically in the developing nations, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but hundreds of thousands of tons are still being used worldwide every single year. In terms of the production, so the biggest producer for asbestos by far is Russia, followed by Kazakhstan, China, and Brazil. And there are a few smaller producers that are still mining and producing this material. However, the four key producers, users, and exporters are Russia, Kazakhstan, China, and Brazil. Okay, so if we turn our attention to the Middle East, asbestos has been used here commercially since about the 1960s. The increases in the exploration of oil and gas led to the increases in construction, and the material of choice at the time was, of course, as you can guess, asbestos. So much so that at one stage in history, 20% of the world's asbestos that was produced was being used in the Middle East. Thankfully, 7 countries have now prohibited or banned the use of asbestos in the Middle East and GCC. They are Oman, UAE, KSA, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. So all of the GCC countries, and as well as Jordan. So a few prohibitions in place already. However, most of these bans didn't come into effect until around 2006, 2007. So if 65,000 tons of asbestos was imported into the Middle Eastern region in 2007 alone, if you extrapolate that back to the 1960s, that is a huge amount of asbestos fibre that's been brought into the Middle Eastern region. Okay. So we've seen that asbestos is a common building material. We've also seen that it has deadly effects if you're exposed to it. So what does it look like? So for the next section of the presentation, I'm going to show you photos of a number of different asbestos materials here in the Middle East. Perhaps you'll recognize some of them yourselves. Perhaps you've encountered them. What I would like to do is just talk you through the most common locations and talk to you a little bit about where you could encounter these materials in the buildings that you live in, the buildings that you work in, and ones that you frequent or visit on a regular basis. Okay, so starting off with the lower risk asbestos containing materials. These are asbestos containing vinyl floor tiles. These tiles were identified in a villa in Satwa in Dubai during an asbestos survey. We collected samples of the floor tiles and found that there was chrysotile white asbestos in the tile itself and also in the adhesive directly underneath. We worked with an asbestos removal contractor to safely remove these tiles. That was disposed of as asbestos waste, and the building could be safely demolished. Now, this material is relatively low risk. It's very difficult for the fibers to be released because they're bonded into the matrix of the tile. So relatively low risk. This is another photo of some asbestos vinyl floor tiles. This photo was taken from an oil rig off the coast of Abu Dhabi. Now, these kind of tiles can be found pretty much anywhere where you need an easy to clean floor. So kitchens, pantries, schools, hospitals, plant rooms, anywhere where you need a floor that can easily be cleaned, you could find asbestos containing vinyl floor tiles. Again, low risk, takes a significant amount of damage to release any fiber. Okay, one of the most common asbestos containing materials in the Middle East. These are asbestos containing gaskets. Anywhere where you have two pieces of metal joined together, you'll find a gasket in between to enable the seal. Now, there's a good chance that that gasket could contain asbestos. Not all gaskets contain asbestos, but certainly it seems to be the case in the Middle East. It used to be the case that it was only in older gasket materials. However, every year now, we come across companies that are still using asbestos gaskets in UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait. I think we've come across them in all of the GCC countries now. Typically find them in stores, in warehouses, and unfortunately, it's still very easy to buy these asbestos gaskets online. It's something that I'll cover in a moment later in the presentation. So these are images of what the gaskets look like when they're inside a joint or a flange. You can see this gasket is going to be installed. And this is what they look like when they are in a warehouse or a store ready to be used. So this photo was taken from a carpentry area in a warehouse in Jebel Ali. They come in all different colors, shapes and sizes. On this particular occasion, it was the gray and the red gaskets that contained asbestos. Now, anyone cutting those gasket materials to size them so that they can put them inside the pipework or inside the machinery and equipment is potentially running the risk of exposing themselves to asbestos fiber. When people don't even know that they're working with asbestos, then they're not going to be wearing PPE, respiratory protective equipment, cutting the asbestos material, releasing the dust, the dust particles go deep down to the lungs, and then effectively become asbestos-related diseases. So this is what the gaskets look like when they're cut to size. And this is what they look like when they come from the manufacturer. So this is typically what we would find would come from a manufacturer, a factory, or an online website. So not all gaskets are asbestos, but in the Middle East, a significant number of them are, especially this Prime Seal brand. It seems to be very prevalent in the Middle East, and it's always asbestos. Okay, so I believe we may be being joined by some members from Abu Dhabi. Some of you may recognize the skyline there. That is the skyline of Abu Dhabi City. This is asbestos bitumen roofing felt. And this was identified underneath concrete tiles during the rehabilitation of one of the biggest forts in the center of Abu Dhabi. So the bitumen was underneath the concrete tiles, and we worked with an asbestos removal contractor to remove all of the tiles and the asbestos containing bitumen to dispose of that as asbestos waste. Again, relatively low risk. It would take a significant amount of damage and disturbance to release the fibres into the air. Okay, asbestos cement water pipes, one of the most common asbestos materials again in the Middle East. These are typically used for water supply, potable water, sewerage, stormwater drains. Anywhere where you have pipework underground, there is a very good chance that it could contain asbestos. So anyone involved in any earthworks, they need to be aware of the dangers that asbestos cement pipes could be present down in the ground when they're digging into that material. Much like the gaskets, comes in all different shapes and sizes, thicknesses and bores. That photo was taken from a project downtown in central Dubai. If you look closely, you can just about make out the name of the asbestos company that used to be based in Dubai. They used to manufacture nearly all of the asbestos pipes here in the UAE. Small ones, big ones. This is a stormwater drain, and probably the biggest piece of asbestos I've ever come across in my life. It was so big that there was actually somebody sleeping inside of it, and there was blankets. I don't know whether they were trying to shelter from the sun, but yeah, someone had been sleeping inside of this giant asbestos stormwater drain. That was found in Ras Al Khor in Dubai. Again, some more asbestos cement pipes. Central Dubai, near a big convention center. So you may be able to guess which one it is. As you can see, the cement pipes here, and you have flush edges, which have been cut with an angle grinder. So anyone cutting through those particular pipes with an angle grinder would have released huge amounts of dust into the air. People not wearing protective equipment, RPE, PPE, and you can see two young ladies walking past here at the same time. So not good controls in place on this particular project, probably because the people doing it weren't aware of the risks of the work that they were doing. The strangest use I've ever come across for asbestos cement pipes. In someone's back garden, they decided to turn these asbestos cement pipes into flower pots. So very, very diverse usage of asbestos cement pipes. Okay, I mentioned a moment ago that there used to be an asbestos factory in Dubai, and this was located in one of the central locations of Dubai. So you can see Dubai Airport at the top of the screen there, Dubai Creek and Festival City. So up until about 2011, there was a major asbestos factory in the center of Dubai. They pretty much had a monopoly on producing potable water pipes, sewerage pipes, and they were in operation for 40 to 50 years, meaning that there is a huge amount of asbestos cement pipes in the ground in the UAE. Okay, I'm sure many people recognize this material. This is corrugated asbestos cement roof sheeting, found all over the UAE, typically used as car parking shades, sometimes for garages. It's relatively low risk. If it's in a good condition, it doesn't pose too much of a hazard to human health. The only time that it would be an issue is if someone drills into the asbestos itself, or if someone undertakes uncontrolled demolition. Now, if it's in a good condition, it's low risk. If it's in a poor condition, it's not such a good thing. You can see on the screen there are a number of villas or asbestos cement sheets that have been demolished. And you can see in the foreground here, significant amounts of damage. I think a vehicle or some machinery had tracked over the top of these asbestos cement sheets. This was in a residential area of Satwa, and every time the wind would blow, you could see the dust and the fibers being released into the air. So not an ideal situation for a residential location of Dubai. If the sheets are in a good condition, like on the top of a building, low risk. If this material is badly damaged or disturbed, it can be classed as medium to high risk. Now, a number of years ago, this is the damage and destruction that took place a number of years ago in a central location in Dubai. So each one of these red X's represents a group of 4 villas, each with an asbestos cement roof. Now, sadly, all of these buildings were demolished without having the asbestos removed. So significant amounts of dust were created, potentially exposing the local residents and spreading the asbestos far and wide. Did it end up actually being investigated by a journalist from the National? And it made front page news. So you can see there on the screen, from the National, deadly dust, Dubai residents fear asbestos exposure. And the date of that was 2013. So the journalist interviewed residents, the developer, the contractor even doing the demolition, and requested an interview with the municipality. However, nothing ever came of it. There were no fines, no penalties, and no stop to the demolition. So even though there is legislation and controls in place, accidents do happen, and sometimes unscrupulous companies will go ahead and demolish buildings that still have asbestos in them. I'll cover the legislation section next, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Okay, moving up the risk hierarchy a little bit and getting to be more medium to high risk. This is braided asbestos insulation. Now, anywhere where you have a fire pump room, generator room, a hot exhaust, you could potentially find braided asbestos insulation. It's essentially a wrap that will go around an exhaust for fireproofing and heat proofing. And it has 100% asbestos content. So the brilliant white material that you see here is 100% white asbestos. Now, this photo was taken in a generator room in Abu Dhabi, an emergency generator room. And the maintenance team every month would turn the generator on to make sure that it was operational for 1 hour at a time. And the pipework and the asbestos would shake like crazy. And you can actually see the asbestos fibers being released into the air. So because of the high asbestos content, because the fact that it is friable and releases fibers into the air, it's a more high risk asbestos material. So that was in the generator room. And the next photo, this was in a fire pump room. Now you can usually recognize this material because it's really a brilliant white asbestos material. It's wrapped around the exhaust, pretty much like a textile, like a shirt, and it's most commonly found in fire pump rooms and emergency generator rooms. Now again, this is one of the most common asbestos containing materials in the Middle East. It's very heat resistant, fire resistant, but the bad thing about it is it leaves asbestos dust and debris everywhere that it's installed. So high risk asbestos containing material. Okay, we're now looking at high risk, very high risk asbestos materials. This is asbestos insulating board, otherwise known as AIB. Now it's regarded as friable. Now friable means that it has the potential to release a lot of asbestos fiber into the air. So if you think about something like a ceiling tile, all you would need to do with your hands is to break those ceiling tiles, and you can imagine huge amounts of dust being released. Anyone in the vicinity of that dust would breathe the fibers in quite easily. So friable and high risk asbestos material. In this photo, it's ceiling tiles, but it could just easily be partition walls, riser panels, or shuttering, so many different uses. That photo was taken in a recreational facility in one of the storerooms in Abu Dhabi. More asbestos insulating board, this time quite badly damaged. As you can see, the grey material and the fibres pretty much sticking out. This was from a hotel in Sharjah in the back of house areas. And you can just see a doorway at the bottom of the screen. Now, this was a heavy door, and every time the door would bang shut, it would vibrate this asbestos, releasing the fibre in the air, potentially exposing anyone that stood in the vicinity. So again, another high-risk asbestos material. Okay, the highest of high-risk asbestos materials in the Middle East. This is thermal or asbestos pipe insulation. So I'm not sure if we're being joined by any members from Qatar, but you may recognize the skyline in the background of West Bay. So on this particular photo, you can see the thermal asbestos insulation. High asbestos content, very, very friable. You would only need to brush past that and you would release huge amounts of fibre into the air. So very, very dangerous type of asbestos containing material. Okay, so we've seen a number of different types of asbestos containing material in the Middle East. How do we control the risk? Well, one of the ways in which you can do that is through legislation. So I'm going to be focusing on the legislation here in UAE. Other legislation is present in the other GCC countries. So obviously Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, KSA, but the most developed asbestos legislation is here in the UAE. Now, many of you members, I hope you're all aware of the difference between federal legislation and local legislation. Federal legislation obviously relates to all 7 emirates, and local legislation is specific to the emirate that it's written for. So I'll just talk you through the key pieces of legislation that relate to asbestos management to let you know how it could potentially impact upon yourselves as health and safety professionals. Okay, so the first piece of asbestos legislation, this is Cabinet Resolution 39 of 2006, otherwise known as the Prohibition of Asbestos Regulation. It's reflected in Estidama and the Green Building Regulations, and it's widely accepted to be the asbestos ban for the UAE. Now, what 39 of 2006 states is, as of November 2006, it is illegal to manufacture, import, or use asbestos boards. So November 2006. However, there are some intricacies in the legislation. Number one, every company that was producing asbestos-containing materials was given a 1-year shutdown period. So theoretically, November 2006 becomes November 2007. Any building built before November 2007 could potentially contain asbestos. The other thing to mention is the prohibition was not absolute. So in the legislation itself, it says asbestos boards. It doesn't mention gaskets, it doesn't mention insulations, water pipes, or the other 3,000 or so building products that could potentially contain asbestos. It specifically mentions asbestos boards, which in my opinion, it leaves it open to a little bit of interpretation. However, it is generally accepted as being the prohibition of asbestos regulation here in the UAE. Now, when it comes to legislation, legislation is only as good as the enforcement, and it's only as good as people abiding by that particular legislation. So on the screen now, you can see some braided asbestos insulation. And this is from a building that was constructed in 2013. So the asbestos ban was 2006, 2007. This building is a building that I used to live in. And every morning I would drive through the car park and I would drive past this braided asbestos insulation. So it proves the point that even if there is an asbestos ban, even if there is legislation, asbestos, unfortunately, is still making its way into construction projects and into the country. So where does it come from? Well, if you look hard enough in a number of different areas of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, the Northern Emirates, you can still unfortunately find asbestos-containing materials. So this is a photo of asbestos corrugated cement roof sheets from down in Satwa, still being sold by a building merchant down in the middle of Dubai. And the bigger problem that we've got is that it's incredibly easy to buy asbestos online. So all you need really to go and buy some asbestos products is a credit card, set up an account on Alibaba, and you're in business to buy any asbestos containing materials you want. So I'm sure most people will have heard of Alibaba. It's effectively the Chinese version of Amazon or eBay. And as you can see, this section here, from a screenshot I took yesterday, over 27,000 different products online that you can buy today that contain asbestos. They're gaskets, they're insulations, they're boards, very, very easy to get hold of, very easy to buy and unfortunately import into pretty much anywhere in the world. Now you don't have to take my word for it, as it's made the national news a number of times. So Khalij Times in 2009, bearing in mind the ban was 2006, stated that asbestos is still being sold despite the ban. A few years later, the National, asbestos found in new buildings in Dubai and Abu Dhabi despite the ban. So this was an article that identified that new residential developments, commercial properties, and shockingly even in schools, asbestos is still being used. So the legislation is good, but the enforcement sometimes could be a little bit better. And I think it's just too easy to get hold of asbestos containing materials and bring them into the country because you can order it so easily online. Okay, the second piece of federal legislation. Now, this is Ministerial Decision 42 of 2008, otherwise known as the Demolition and Refurbishment legislation. Again, what is stated in this piece of legislation is reflected in the Estadama and Green Building Regulations. And I'll talk you through the key points now. So basically, we're talking about demolition and asbestos waste disposal procedures. Prior to the demolition of any building, you must have what's known as an asbestos-free building certificate. Disposal of asbestos waste must be done within the emirates that it's produced, and there is a pre-qualification and requirements for the competency of contractors involved in demolition, asbestos removal, and asbestos consultancy. So by way of example, in Abu Dhabi, any asbestos removal company operating there must be registered with Tadweer, or the Centre of Waste Management, just like any asbestos consultant must be registered with OSHAD or Abu Dhabi Public Health. So 42 of 2008 states, asbestos-free building certificates, you need to make sure all of your asbestos is removed prior to demolition, and any contractors undertaking this work must be specialists and they must be registered with the regulatory authorities. Again, the legislation is only as good as people abiding by it. And I talked you through a project or a site down in Satwa in Dubai, where a number of buildings were demolished that contained asbestos. So any of our Dubai-based residents may recognize the skyline there, although I'm sure it's changed since 2013, which is when this photo was taken. You can see the Burj Khalifa in the background, and you can see a demolition site in the foreground. in the very foreground of the photo, significant amounts of badly damaged and demolished asbestos cement. Sadly, these buildings were completely collapsed. No safety procedures were put in place, and all of that asbestos was damaged, disturbed, releasing the asbestos fibers into the air in a residential area. This is where the national article, the journalists came along and undertook their investigative journalism and published their article on the front page of the National. Go back one slide. So that was in July of 2013. However, it makes me sad to report that this kind of thing is still happening. So I was on site not less than 2 weeks ago, and during a brand new construction project, you can see being built here, excavator or a digger, JCB, and recently demolished buildings with asbestos containing materials. This is asbestos cement roof sheeting, and you can clearly see that no attempt had been made to remove the asbestos prior to demolition. So although there is legislation in place, and it's good legislation, we need the companies that are involved in construction to abide by this legislation. And in my opinion, we need tighter enforcement of this legislation. Okay, the final piece of legislation that I want to talk to you about is not a federal piece of legislation, it is local legislation. And this is from the Abu Dhabi Occupational Safety and Health System Framework. Probably one of the best pieces of legislation or regulatory frameworks in terms of health and safety in the Middle East. And it applies to all organizations in Abu Dhabi. It's local legislation, so at the moment it only applies to Abu Dhabi, but there are a number of technical guidelines and codes of practice. Now, for asbestos, the code of practice that is relevant is code of practice 1.10, the management of ACMs, or asbestos containing materials. Now, I would say that not only is this the best piece of legislation or guidance in the UAE, I would say it's the best guidance we've got in the whole of the Middle Eastern region. A very, very comprehensive code of practice, and also a very good technical guideline when it comes to asbestos management. If you get the opportunity, if you wanted to learn more about asbestos, I would point you in the direction of this code of practice and technical guideline. Now, one of the interesting things that this COP states is for all non-domestic properties in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, you must have an asbestos survey completed. So if it's a private property, residential, it doesn't apply. But if you think about all of the buildings in Abu Dhabi that are non-domestic, so businesses, infrastructure projects, facilities, where people are employed, non-domestic properties, you must have an asbestos survey completed. This mimics global legislation. So in the UK, we have the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2012. The requirement for an asbestos survey is actually Regulation 4 in the UK. That is what is reflected or mirrored in the Code of Practice here in Abu Dhabi. There's also a requirement, much like the federal legislation, to have registered asbestos supervising consultants with OSHAD, or Abu Dhabi Public Health Centre, and also registered asbestos removal contractors, so that it is the specialist companies that are doing this very dangerous and hazardous work. Okay, so we've seen this legislation, and there is, very good legislation. I would only say that there needs to be more effective control and enforcement, and people need to abide by this legislation, or maybe become a bit more aware of this legislation. So what I want to look at now in the final section of my presentation is a best practice approach. So what can we do better? Now, there's 3 key areas of risk as far as I'm concerned. Number 1, new buildings, new construction. I've mentioned asbestos is coming into the country. How do we stop that? existing buildings, or if you're buying, acquiring, leasing properties. And finally, refurbishments. So what we're going to do is try and talk you through what I see are very easily implementable strategies to manage the asbestos risk for new builds, existing buildings, and refurbishment or demolition. So new builds. I'm sure on the call we have people that are involved in construction. I'm sure there's people that are building new facilities and assets. The last thing that you would want to have happen to your building is for asbestos to be installed. It's extremely timely and costly to remove asbestos once it's inside a building. There's reputational risk associated with that. If it ever got into the public or the press that a brand new building has been filled with asbestos, it'd be a disaster. So what can we do to stop that from happening? The first thing we can do is a contractual prohibition. So all technical documents should include clauses stating that asbestos must not be used. I'm talking about RFPs, RFQs, bill of quantities, most importantly, contractual documents between clients and developers and contractors. So because the subcontractors as well, so contractors and subcontractors, it should clearly be stated asbestos is banned, prohibited material, not to be used on our construction sites. Secondly, anyone involved in reviewing building material specifications should check the documentation of what is being brought on site. Is there an MDHS? Does it say that it's an asbestos material or a non-asbestos material? Gaskets, for example, you have non-asbestos gaskets and you have asbestos gaskets. If you install asbestos gaskets into your site, which is something that we had in a power station in one of the GCC countries, you're talking, firstly, a needle in a haystack situation to try and find that asbestos, and then secondly, huge amounts of cost to remove it. So review technical specifications, MDHSs, make sure no one is bringing asbestos onto your sites. Finally, as a last check, if you have contractors coming onto site, if they have subcontractors coming onto sites, inspect their insulations, inspect their gaskets, have a look at the materials that they're bringing onto site and ask questions. Because if it comes onto your site and it's in the stores, okay, if it comes onto site and they install it into your brand new building, it's a much bigger problem. So new builds, these are the three key things that you can do to limit your asbestos risk. Existing buildings. So this section relates to property owners, building occupants, and a company appointed health and safety professionals. We all live in accommodation. We all work in non-domestic properties. How do we know if there's asbestos in our bedroom, in our flats, our apartments, the office that we work in, the construction site that we're on? The only way to find out is to have an asbestos inspection conducted. So there's different types of asbestos survey. The most common one for existing buildings is a type 2 or management asbestos survey. Consists of a visual inspection, collecting bulk samples and analysing them, and then an asbestos report would be written and provided, including an asbestos register, a risk assessment, and most importantly, recommendations of what to do if asbestos is identified on your site. Typically, it should be conducted by a professional company, an asbestos supervising consultant with years of experience, a knowledge of where common asbestos containing materials are found, competency and qualifications. As I mentioned before, in Abu Dhabi, it's actually a requirement that all non-domestic properties must have an asbestos survey undertaken. And that survey should be undertaken by a registered asbestos supervising consultant. Registered with OSHAD or the Abu Dhabi Public Health Centre. Okay, so that's new builds, existing builds, and finally refurbishment and demolition. So this is the very last part of my presentation. If you're going to demolish a building, the worst thing that you could do is do what the people did in Satwa, and that is to demolish a building that still has asbestos in it. So you need an asbestos-free building certificate, and there's a process that you should go through. I'll quickly talk you through it. It's very easy, makes common sense. Number one, you need a refurbishment or demolition asbestos survey. Now, this is a more intrusive type of asbestos survey, breaking holes in walls, looking above ceiling tiles, ripping up carpets, looking in every location of the building to identify any asbestos-containing materials that could be damaged or disturbed during refurb or demo. So, refurbishment and demolition asbestos survey. Stage two, if you identify asbestos-containing materials, or if the consultant does, there needs to be asbestos removal. Now, this should be conducted by a specialist asbestos supervising consultant and asbestos removal contractor. Stage three, the removal should be validated. So an independent or an impartial person should come along, visually inspect that all of the asbestos has been removed. Sometimes there's a requirement for airborne fibre monitoring as well. And once the validation is conducted and it's satisfactory, the consultant will produce your asbestos-free building certificate. Only once you've got the asbestos-free building certificate, the AFBC, should you then undertake refurbishment or demolition. Now, I know I went through quite a lot of information there. So what I'd like to do is point you towards a very good resource as we're coming to the end of my presentation now. If you're looking for any additional information when it relates to asbestos in the Middle East, there is a website called asbestos.ae. Now, on this website, you will find information related to everything that I've spoken about today, asbestos surveys, removal, air monitoring, and there's a number of blog posts specifically for the Middle East. So they're related to issues that you and I would come across in the Middle East, bits and pieces about legislation, and what are the best practices approaches to manage asbestos risk here in the UAE and the wider Middle East region. Okay, I'm very much drawing towards the end of my presentation. I hope I haven't spoken for too long. So I'm going to thank you all for your time, and hopefully we have received some questions. Now, I haven't been monitoring the chats because I've been busy doing the presentation itself. It sounds like someone else has come on. Maybe that's Said.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very comprehensive presentation it was. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us. We have a few questions that Mr. Hafiz asked, what is the medical test?
Medical test? Yeah, so if you were wanting to undertake a medical test because you were concerned that you had been exposed to asbestos, typically it would be a lung function test. They would check the capacity of your lungs. You can go for an X-ray as well. So that could potentially identify any issues. I myself, because I'm an asbestos specialist professional, I go for a 2-year medical. So every 2 years, I will go for lung function tests and sometimes X-rays to check to see if there's any issue.
Okay, thank you. Another question is there any lifespan after disposal of the asbestos?
Sorry, so is there any
lifespan after disposal of asbestos?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the first part of the question. Is there any less?
Okay, yes,
lifespan.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, lifespan.
Yeah. No, asbestos is almost indestructible. You can burn it, you can use chemicals. It is almost indestructible. So the only thing you can really do with it is to dispose of it in a licensed landfill cell. Now, essentially what they do there is they will bury it and then put a number of geopermeable membrane underneath, and then topsoil on the top, and then that landfill cell can never be used for anything else. So it's indestructible almost. That's why it makes such a good material in terms of its fireproofing, heat resistant, chemical resistant attack. However, it has the effects of causing asbestos related diseases and cancers in humans.
Is there any device to detect asbestos or identify?
Yep. The only real way to identify it is through survey and through laboratory analysis. So small samples of the material are collected. They're then sent to a laboratory and they use different types of scientific techniques to identify, firstly, whether it's asbestos or not, and then also the fiber type and sometimes the concentration. So in short, it has to be laboratory analysis, sampling conducted by a professional consultancy company.
Okay, one more question. What products are made from asbestos as home appliances? Like what items are containing the asbestos for home appliances, like stove, dryers, or coffee pots, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it does occasionally happen that you would find asbestos in thermal flasks. So there was an article in the newspapers up in Ras Al Khaimah saying that a number of flasks for hot and cold drinks contained asbestos. Sometimes hair dryers that you would have in very old hair salons, very rare now to be honest with you. And then sometimes on ironing boards, where you place the iron, you could potentially find a household ironing board that has an asbestos pad. But really, it's in the building structures. So corrugated roof sheeting, ceiling tiles, floor tiles, insulations, and gaskets being the most common building materials in the Middle East that contain asbestos.
Thank you. TLV and PEL for asbestos fiber, someone is asking.
TLV, so it's related to
TLV.
exposure.
Yeah.
Sorry?
TLV and PEL.
Okay, so we're talking exposure limits.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is no known safe exposure limits to asbestos. Much like smoking, one person could smoke for 30 years and have no effects from smoking. Another person could smoke for 2 years and get smoking related lung cancer. It's the same with the UK. So it's the same with asbestos. Some people are affected very significantly by asbestos exposure, and others could work in an asbestos factory and be unaffected. There are different guidelines on what the exposure limits are in different countries, and there are specific levels here in the UAE. I would only say that the levels in the UAE, as they are in the federal and local guidelines, are very high because they were set in the 1980s. They don't really reflect international best practice, with the exception of the legislation in Abu Dhabi, which has newer exposure limits and more realistic maximum exposure limits.
Thank you. How to identify the presence of asbestos in material?
Again, it would have to be laboratory analysis, but you would need to have a consultant or somebody that has an asbestos qualification who can recognize the kind of materials that could contain asbestos. Because it's been found in over 3,000 products, 3,200, you have to know what to look for in order to collect the samples and then obviously understand whether that material could potentially contain asbestos or not.
Okay, any PP or RP is required to handle the asbestos material?
Yeah. There's very specific types of PPE and respiratory protective equipment. So much like the COVID coveralls that have been used, the Tyvek, they need to be of a certain specification for asbestos. And then masks. So the masks that must be used must be FFP3. So the COVID masks that we use, I believe they are FFP2, the N95s. They're not sufficient for asbestos. It needs to be FFP3 with a HEPA filter.
Last but not least, what symptoms we face when coming into contact with asbestos?
Well, so immediately you wouldn't face any symptoms at all, but in 10, 20 or 30 years after asbestos exposure, when these diseases start to manifest themselves, the two main things are a persistent cough, so a cough that won't go away, and also pain in the chest. So you could have a pain in the side that just won't go away.
That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Syed, show is yours.
Charlie, thank you very much. It was indeed very informative sessions, and I believe that everyone enjoyed. A few of the questions been remained, which we will definitely answer. I'm looking into the chat box. People are asking for the certificate. Yes, we IOSH provide the certificate of attendees. The presentation will be definitely available at the UAE page. Any other queries can be asked through the IOSH UAE branch email address or the LinkedIn, or you can approach us. So all of these questions will be definitely answered later on if it is missing, or if any question which we had missed. Once again, from the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of my committee, IOSH, we are really thankful to all of you guys for attending, sparing your time. Special thanks to Louise, the president of IOSH. She appeared for a while and explained the future journey for IOSH and the existing events of the IOSH. As usual, thank you very much, Catherine, for facilitating these events and always be there for us. And your presence indeed. Charles, thank you very much. It was indeed great. I'm concluding this event. Would you like to have any comment or anything, or shall I wind up?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to present. And on the presentation screen now, you can see my contact details, the website, asbestos.ae. If anyone has any asbestos related questions that they come up with later, that they didn't want to ask right now, I'd be happy to answer them. So feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to answer any of the questions that you may have after the presentation today. So thank you.
Thank you very much and stay blessed. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.